Hiya Bernhard, lovely to meet up with you and do some work on your game up at the range. Just a quick recap first of all on a few minor changes that we made at setup, just to make the setup a lot more appropriate for what you're trying to achieve within the golf swing. At the start of the session we had a number of issues at setup P1. First one was that the stance would get a little bit too wide, so a little bit too much space between the heels, so we'd want to narrow that a little bit. What we also had was a situation where the upper centre of the shoulder turn, is out in front of the lower centre, the centre of the hip girdle. That's creating a side bend towards the target and is creating a situation where both shoulders are very level. Add to that, we've got a ball that's very much back of your 0 point. So 0 point is the left shoulder. Your ball is too far back of that 0 point, which in turn is creating too much of a steep angle of attack and therefore potentially too much of an outward hit at the golf ball. Just rephrase that one. There you go. So the first change we made was just to gently put the ankles a little bit closer together. We could still go a little bit closer than that. We wanted to feel here that the ball was nearer to 0 point and therefore a little bit less back in the stance, creating a little bit less of a downward and outward hit. And we also wanted to feel like the handle was a little bit further forward. You can see here we've also got still a little bit too much side bend towards the target. So sort of after about 30 minutes of working on the setup and hitting a few different shots, what we end up with now is a much more balanced setup. The gap between the heels is less. The handle is pointing more towards the centre of the left thigh. We've got a situation now where both centres are pretty much stacked over the top of one another, maybe a little bit of a lean towards the target. We can live with that a little bit. Ideally we'd want to push the hips forward sort of towards the target this way, another inch or so, just to balance that side bend up. We can see now that the shoulders are in a much more appropriate position, where the right shoulder is just a fraction lower than the left. The upper centre of gravity is still in line with the centre of the stance. Just ignore that arrow. Windows 8's having a bit of a nightmare on me. And we've also got from the less of a downward hit, so we've got the ball again a little bit nearer to 0 point, so that ball position is a little bit more appropriate for 6-iron. Now we're hitting down on it a little bit less. We still want to hit down on it, but not quite as much, and therefore the swing isn't directed out to the right quite as substantially as it was at the start of your session. So if you get rid of all those lines and just take a little look how much more balanced the setup looks from the start of your session to say sort of 30 minutes into your session, you can see that there's a marked improvement in the way you address the golf ball. What we talked about then and we'll come to in your next recap. Apologise for the arrows, Bernhard. It's the software's having a bit of a funny one this morning. As we were coming through the golf ball, pretty centred turn on the way back. We start to release the club very, very early. The radius of the swing is too wide coming into the golf ball, and the handle is too far back at impact. Through impact, we get a situation where the upper centre gets out in front of the lower centre once again, and that's almost preset anyway. So we get this situation where we look like we're leaning forward rather than tucking underneath, which is something that you mentioned you'd had issues with. So the next recap that comes, that's just a little overview of your setup changes that I want you to make. Heels closer together, ball nearer to the left shoulder, handle pointing more towards the centre of the left thigh, and just push the hips towards the target just a fraction more than what you're seeing on the far right. But the far right's a much more appropriate position to be in at P1. The next review that I put up there will be covering more the swing related issues that we discussed just briefly there, and going into a little bit more detail about the drills that I'd like to use between now and when we get together next in September. Well done.